Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel-Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 15 of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. Today is part 2, the compelling conclusion of my interview with Nicole Florisi and Kliem, a dynamic and informative training duo. If you can, catch last week's episode to hear about their amazing career paths and the lead up to this week's episode. If you don't have a chance to listen to that episode, no worries. This episode is great as a standalone interview. I'm going to start right where we left off from last week, with me asking a question about the trauma impact comparison between use of force incidents and how police officers are treated by their employers versus the trauma impact of a rape or a sexual assault experience on a victim from a known perpetrator. We'll catch you on the other side. Is there an impact difference between sex assault victims who don't know that they're going to be sexually assaulted by someone they love versus an impact of a police officer knowing going to work that he's going to possibly be shot at or have to shoot someone? What he doesn't know is what you just talked about, and that's whether or not the department's going to be for you or against you.
I think your initial thing comes from resiliency, though, to be honest. I don't think the knowing. To me, the knowing that it could happen is like stress exposure. It's, you know it, and how are you prepared for it? You know it, and what training did you get? You know it, and what coping and grit and resilience do you have? Knowing alone, you might as well just be, ringing like Pavlov's bell. I mean, to me,
Sure.
because we all know. Now, if you know and it becomes a problem, you are going to start to become hypervigilant, right? Your focus will be the fact that, is it today? Is it every traffic stop, right? And you get that heightened amygdala, and you start, experiencing some of those. But for most people, because Vaughn hit the population, there's people who know that and they embrace that because they look at it as a challenge, not a threat. Yeah. A lot of this is I don't even want to get into the whole warrior guardian mindset thing, but to be honest, like a warrior mindset is embracing what may come, but you have the skill to deal with it. And I don't think that diminishes any guardian. We are guardians of human life. We are guardians of many things, so many different layers. But the bottom line is, to me, that it's not the knowing, it's the preparation of what may come. And that, it's cliche in training, Vaughn, and then I'll turn it over to you. It's that saying, you don't rise to the level of your training, you sink to the level, right? But do you sink here or do you sink here? It's that preparation of resiliency and grit and coping and integration in the training program to build that skill set. Because we all know, every single officer knows that today could be the day. And that is handled on an absolute micro individual level across the board for every single officer. And so it's what's different. And Vaughn, I know you want to say something, so let me turn that over to you.
No, I think it's right. I keep pushing back in all of our case evaluations that national statistics are irrelevant to that individual's response and that individual threat assessment response. We're only looking at one individual. So I always hesitate when I hear police know they're about to be shot. Not if they keep that to the forefront, if they've embraced that warrior mentality, knowing today could be the day, and they've engaged in the conduct that allows them to meet that drag and to meet that challenge, then yes, the answer is going to be they're more prepared for it. They're more prepared. The trouble comes if what they saw in training was not reflected in the real world event, if something was different. And those things we look for, that again, from trauma informed or what we might expect from the human, is if there's a high level of uncertainty, it happened too fast, they couldn't make sense of it so that it could map to a prior experience. Right? They didn't know how to map to a prior experience. And so this was brand new to them and it was too much and it was overwhelming. That's going to be very different no matter how much they trained. If that training didn't look like the real world or look like that one specific event. And sometimes criminals have a whole lot more creativity than we do in a training world and a lot less limits. And so you see things on the street, as you know, Dave and Nicole, that we can't recreate, the level of malevolence. And that gives me the second thing. Malevolence directed towards the individual will heighten the traumatic response, right? If I'm just a nameless, faceless cop who just got attacked, bad enough, right? But when they're coming after me, when they're calling me out by name, and it's with hatred, that level of malevolence and hatred is going to increase the traumatic response. And the other thing is a lack of predictability, a lack of certainty. We crave predictability. We have to be able to make sense of what we're seeing and predict it. That where the agency betrayal and the incident marry up is when an officer who skillfully engages in the real world survives it. Or let's even victims of sexual assault. How many times have we looked at victims and we said, and we were thinking, whether we said it out loud, you did so many things right that contributed to your survival. All they know is they were victims. They were assaulted, they were abused, and they are broken. And we can look at it, having seen the breadth of cases where victims did not come out of it, and we think to ourselves, wow, you did a lot of things to contribute. You did a lot of things right. You did everything right that has resulted in you being here. And reframing that at some point, I leave that to Nicole and the therapist, but getting them to recognize they weren't actually helpless in that sense. They would actually did a lot of things right. And the same thing with police. If they expertly negotiate that violence, even if they're injured, and then they get to, there's a level of predictability. Now they know what's next. Now they're going home. They're going back to their tribe. They're going back to their support system, and they can breathe and feel safe and protected and not alone anymore. Right. It's the other thing about trauma is when you feel like you're in isolation, not part of that team. And they go back to that agency who then takes them, pulls them away from their tribe, puts them in the back of a police car, takes their gun from them, maybe not replace it, gives them what I call as a chaperone. I mean, it's a support buddy, but could feel like now they're not allowed to even walk through their agency by themselves anymore. A place that had, restricted access, but they had access. That was their tribe. Now they have to have a battle buddy. They have to have someone escort them everywhere. And then they get into that interview, and that brings it to a head. The level of betrayal where we're looking at it or have been focusing most recently, we're certainly able to expand and contract as we need as we continue to put on these presentations. They get into that interview room and all of a sudden they are suspects. Their judgments being questioned. They turn it in, instead of help me understand your experience, they do an after action review. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Did you think about this? Did you think about that? And they start provoking confabulation by asking questions that no human would reasonably be expected to answer, and yet we're inclined to want to answer it. And we leave them depleted. And my experience and what I've been hearing and reading about and in talking to officers is the most stressful part of the critical incident event, pre, during, and post, was the post-event administrative investigation, how they were treated, how they were felt that they were liars and that they were using excessive force and that they were malevolent and that they were racist and this is bad enough if this comes from some activist attorney out there, but it's coming from their own agency, from their own leaders, from the prosecutors who they've built cases alongside of their whole careers, now focusing that prosecutorial power on them. That's the level of betrayal that we're saying, look, if you're doing that intentionally, shame on you. We're concerned about the inadvertent communication of betrayal. That's what we think. If it's just an absence of skill and sensitivity, whether it's in the sexual assault world or the police world, we can fix that. Like we can educate and get our investigators to recognize how to stop provoking confabulation, how to stop communicating betrayal. Nicole hit a perfect thing. And Dave, you might remember, Nicole, in our training with sexual assault, we would talk about content, voice, and other nonverbals, and that the "I believe you" strategic narrative is, you can't shock me. I believe you. You're safe here. Conveying all that through your facial expressions was part of our training, and we would actually do teach backs to the students and show them. And I remember in a real world case where I was talking to a victim, and the overwhelming graphic inhumanity that this victim had to experience at the hands of her husband would make anybody just recoil and cringe. I mean, it was absolutely disgusting what this man did to her. But I remember just breathing through it and looking at her with no less compassion and interest and being present with her. But in my head, I'm thinking, wow, this would be hard for people to hear if they weren't sensitive to the need to stay present and not make it about themselves. Continue to listen, right? But that's the type of betrayal, we're talking about, Dave. We've been sending that to sexual assault victims for decades, right? Inexperienced, unsophisticated, unskilled interviewers, not to mention the ones who are just not just bad at their jobs, but they're just bad people who want to call other people liars and make it a game to see if they catch them in lies. Those people are, they're just in the wrong business. They're not fit for the purpose of those types of investigations. But we can help the ones who are doing it inadvertently.
I guess part of where I want to go with everything that you're talking about then with betrayal is what you're doing with regard to the training aspect. Is it more for administration, what you're teaching in terms of learning not to be betrayers? Or is it more towards be prepared as maybe the first responders, be prepared for betrayal, or here's what to do if you are in a situation of betrayal? What are you training with your force science courses?
Well, Nicole and I mean, we are we're hitting whoever shows up in the audience right now, which is police, executive leaders, attorneys. They're all there right now. These are just pretty mixed groups. Unfortunately, if this is your business model and this is the population of people who want to go out, they all need it. They all need to understand the role they play in inadvertently communicating betrayal. And so if it's the executive leaders, look, any force encounter, I teach a course for attorneys on how to evaluate force cases, high profile force cases or your everyday cases. And that's great. I have to sensitize them to these type of issues. But I also teach one for executive leaders to remind them of the role they play in a force encounter investigation, in the immediate aftermath, and in the policy development, and in the training. And we cover all of it because it all matters. But one of the things that we teach executive leaders, particularly the chiefs and the sheriffs, the decision makers, is when you know the outcome of a case, you have outcome bias, you have certainty bias. You will then go back and evaluate that case as though the outcome was much more certain and predictable than it actually was. And that will not inure to the benefit of the officer who was facing those tense, uncertain, rapidly evolving, unpredictable circumstances and making fast and frugal decisions. And so we have to remind them when Von Kliem looks at a use of force case, I have to consciously remind myself not to evaluate every decision point as though it was leading to a deadly force shooting. I have to look at it. What did the officer know in that moment?
Yeah.
And knowing what they knew in that moment, was that a reasonable decision? And that is something, it is an active process that we have to engage in our force evaluations. It's the same active process we're encouraging the chief of police and his staff to do, because what we continue to see in the worst cases, I mean, some chiefs are phenomenal, as Nicole pointed out. Some sheriffs, they get this stuff, and they would be looking at me crazy, like, who would do that, right? But we get the bad cases, and we see the examples of the bad ones, where a chief will look at a video and go, "Oh, we're screwed." And I'm thinking, Chief, you didn't interview the officer. The reasonableness of that threat assessment, or whether it's a victim's behavior, right? The counterintuitive victim behaviors that we spend so much time studying, or the reasonableness of an officer's threat assessment or the officer's behavior during the incident, it's based on what the officer perceived and the meaning that was assigned to that information. And if you don't know what the officer perceived or the victim perceived, or what meaning they assigned to that bucket of information, then how are we evaluating them, right? And so this is what we're sensitizing the upper echelons to do. So they're not getting behind a podium and in front of cameras saying, we are very concerned about this. We are going to take a look at our policies. We're taking this very seriously. That nothing looked right about this, and we're just thinking, they're going, "Oh, you can't say that." You haven't interviewed an officer. Yeah. But so it's all of the above, Dave. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, because we do not ever want to run out of populations of students. We're going to take them all as they come, but it is all of them.
But you kind of hit on something, Vaughn, that I just want to touch on before we go further. When you talk about policy, you have to think about in enforcement, you can't policy out another human being's behavior. You can't, just like with mandated de-escalation, and that's how I look at it. There is no policy or general order that mandates I can de-escalate you. And I don't really look at it like that, just so you know. I mean, I look at de-escalation, the person de-escalates themselves and we allow safe space, but you can't policy a relationship. You can't write a general order for a relationship. And all force encounters, all human encounters are still at the whim of another human being's behavior. And no policy fixes that. Not in de-escalation, not in force encounters, not anywhere. So, you know, there's that aspect too. We want all these, like, you know, this decision-making package and all that, but we're still at the whim of another human being who is going to make whatever decisions they are going to make. And then we become sometimes, not always, but many times reactive to that situation because we're placed in it. And I think that's another key component where there is this unobtainable standard of perfection that we derive that officers should obtain when the human experience is not that. I mean, it's just really not. The human experience alone, take force out of it. The human experience in and of itself is fluid and ever changing and, you know, cyclical in nature. So, you know, amplify that with a force encounter situation with violence, with ingestion of drugs, with potential mental health symptoms, with a physical health condition that contaminates the mindset, like all of these, and the population that I don't think we talk about enough, deliberate violence against law enforcement, a choice, right? Like I'm anti-law enforcement, anti-authority, anti-conformist, and today you're my target. Like all that.
Violence is the purpose. Yeah,
yeah.
Violence is the purpose for them. Yeah.
So, I mean, you know, all of that factors in too, beyond just, you know, some of the stuff we're talking about, you know, here today. But that's no different than it ties into, honestly, this is why it's humanistic. That ties into your sexual assault population. There's people who do date rape, right? There's people who do things under the influence of drugs, alcohol. There's people who choose their victims very carefully, serial rapists, serial murderers, you know, people with sadistic, I mean, you know, that exists in the human spectrum. So, you know, and I know we kind of morphed a little bit off your betrayal thing, but there's so many factors that, you know, play into this that we could be talking forever, you know, when it comes to this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but intentional deception, like I know it was inferred or implied, but I keep harping on that. A victim of sexual assault is making their decisions based on the available information that they perceive, but that information is often includes intentional lies and deception and efforts to obscure the reality of the situation. And we know after the fact that's just true. Well, we see that in force encounters too, where people are like, ow, 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 you hurt my arm, or I can't breathe. And we're looking at that, and cops know, and I like to always frame this what cops know. Cops know that people intentionally engage in deceptive practices to make the threat assessment more ambiguous and the reasonableness of the response then more ambiguous or more controversial. We don't ever let them forget that, you know. And Nicole hit something. When I do policy reviews, there's at least, well, there's 3 criteria, but the 2 that are relevant here is 1, the policy, and therefore the standard of evaluation. So the policy is the law, and ultimately the standard by which we're going to evaluate the officer's conduct must be clear enough that the officer can predict the lawfulness of their own conduct in advance of the conduct. And right now we have officers must use force only when necessary, or must use minimum force. And we go, well, how would they know what that is? Mm-hmm. In advance of using force? Which brings me to the second point. That level of ambiguity is sort of void for vagueness, and we can't hold people accountable to a standard that isn't clear enough that they can predict their own lawfulness of their own behavior. But the second part of that is the standard cannot be beyond human performance capabilities, which was Nicole's point. We do that when we talk about victims not remembering things, right? And we start asking questions and we fail to manage expectations of the reality of that experience. And then we start holding them accountable, one, through our own naivety, to that counterintuitive behavior. They didn't report right away. They went back on another date with the suspect. I wrote an article on LinkedIn, and I encourage your audience to look me up, Kliem at LinkedIn, and look for the article, Speaking with Less Certainty. And it is about how sexual assault investigators analyze sexual assault cases, and that you recognize the experts because they're the ones who speak with the least amount of certainty. They understand that there's so much they don't know, and they understand. One of the lines what reminded me of one of the lines in there was that Facebook photos of with smiles act as it ends up. I don't know the quote, but it ends up acting as the alibi for the suspect. Like, he rapes her on Monday, and on Wednesday there's a Facebook photo of them with their arms around each other, and it's betraying them. It's acting as an alibi for him. And sexual assault experts would look at that and go, that Facebook photo means nothing. It does nothing to establish the credibility of that victim 2 days earlier who said no, and he did it anyway, right? And so I bring that up because the same in force encounters, and again, it goes back to sexual assault, back to force encounters, back to sexual assault. The experts will speak with the least amount of certainty because of the high level of uncertainty and unpredictability involved in these investigations.
Well, and Vaughn, when you hit about the intentional deception, I mean, think about, and you have both had interviews and experiences with this, male or female population, when they orgasm during a sexual assault. Who wants to tell a cop that? The body's the body. Sometimes it responds. How embarrassing for people. They're going to leave that out. But if during the interview with the suspect, they may bring it up, right? And if people don't understand, that's just basic physiology. When I was working at that domestic violence shelter, one challenge we had was females understanding that men could be raped too. They really couldn't wrap their head around that the men would also have a physiological response, right? And that's a hard sell for some people. So, and to me, that's an education component, no different than I'm asking for education in force encounters. But if you don't know that the body's going to do what the body knows, if you don't know that a person can have an orgasm during an assault, even a potentially very violent assault, because the body's the body and stimulation is stimulation, and whatever that looks like, those are education components. If we know those things, we're more likely to be, like Mom said, sophisticated interviewers, sensitive to the information, but also understanding if that doesn't get disclosed and comes out later, no kidding, because who would want to look somebody you don't know in the face and be like, while I was getting raped, this happened? Or, another example, sometimes, I'm not going to the complete failure of the court system here, but just for a minute, work with me. We had a client basically who had an order of protection against her abuser, but he was still allowed to see the kids. And there was a window where they could see the kids together. So it was only about the children, but she had to travel to see them. But every time she took the kids to see him, he raped her in front of the kids. And she felt she was trapped by the court order because she was mandated to bring those kids to him, even with the violence that was perpetrated against her. And then there was continuous sexual abuse. And she didn't want to report, and she did not want to take the kids because she didn't want to get in trouble for custodial interference. I mean, there's so many layers to this kind of stuff. And one of the things with sexual assault that we don't talk about is it's not a mandated reporting issue unless you're over the age of 18, or I'm sorry, unless you're under the age of 18. I'm sorry. And so when somebody goes to like a shelter, a sanctuary, something, or even to the ER, if protocols aren't in place, and this is education, they're going to call the police there when the person doesn't want them. And it's not, at least I can speak for Arizona, it is not mandatory that there's a police report taken, right? So a lot of these things are education components. And like Vaughn said, we can only, regardless of what area we're trying to focus on, we can only help encourage better behavior with somebody who recognizes there's more to learn, not somebody who is malicious in their intent, or they have their hat hung on, they get hung on a particular point. We can only help encourage, educate, provide information, maybe expand that worldview. for a person who is going to choose to take that journey, to be honest, and be willing to open their mind to it, or maybe they hear a little nugget, it bounces around, and then, that flushes out later. But, those are some of the, fortunate realities in some ways, but unfortunate in others, because some people, they just choose not to be open to other possibilities. They know what they know. Like Vaughn said about, watching a video, oh, this is a problem, or that's a bad shoot, or my favorite quote, I know a good shoot when I see it on video. Oh, do you?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? No, it's so multi-layered. So, but those are, that's all married up in the whole human experience, really.
I had two experiences that I used to propel me in some of my conversation with senior leaders and senior prosecutors. So Dave, I got to teach the American Council of Second Amendment Lawyers force investigations. These were people that were 30-year veteran litigators in use of force, deadly force cases. And the short versions, when we got done, one of them came up, he says, I've had about 110 cases of homicide cases, and I can think of 10 convictions that would have gone the other way had I had this class. And you're like, well, that's great. I'm glad that you learned a lot here, but that's 10 cases that went to conviction that shouldn't have. And this isn't new information. And so that motivates us to get out there and get this stuff out there, because it's, I feel bad for the victim, but these are people who committed their lives, these attorneys, to the defense of others, to trying to do the right thing. And for them to find out 30 years into their career that there was a lot more for them to know that would have made them much better at their job. That was one experience. I want to save people from that experience if I can. The other was a commander down at one of the bases we worked at, and he sat through one of my sexual assault briefings to the senior leadership, and I got called into his office. He was a 06, he was a full-bird colonel, and he says, I'm thinking back to cases when I was a prosecutor of all the victims that I called liars, that I failed to believe. And now that I'm hearing about counterintuitive behaviors and really what it means to not report instantly, and really what it means to be, to stay in contact with your abuser and to go back. He's like, he couldn't sleep at night, right? He stayed up at night with the injustice that he perpetrated inadvertently.
Right.
And we can save people from that, right?
Yeah. And we heard that all the time doing our trainings too, right? That, man, I can think of 30 cases right off the top of my head that I wish I could go back and reinvestigate because of what I've learned here. And it in one sense, you're like, thank goodness you've learned this. In another sense, you're like, oh my gosh, that's 30 cases where the victim didn't get justice. Going back to what you said though earlier about the betrayal issue, and then the other thing that we talked about too is our own bodies reacting to rape the way bodies react. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard this, and even in the last few interviews that I've done for this podcast, victims saying, my body betrayed me. I feel betrayed by my own body and by my own thoughts at the time, doing things to make the rape end sooner in order to make him stop sooner, but doing things that would be interpreted as being consensual or provocation to wanting more sex or more of the actions that he was doing, or she. And that's a huge part of betrayal too, is dealing with that in our own minds. How do we cope with our own bodies betraying us, our own minds betraying us? And I think that totally relates to some of the betrayal that we're talking about in force issues also, is the betrayal from people that we least expected it from. And how do we deal with that? And where do we go with it? I know in the agency I was a police officer in Lafayette, Colorado, the feeling, and you mentioned this earlier too, is the feeling was that we were a family, that the agency was a family unit. We took care of each other until we didn't,
Right.
That betrayal issue. It's just an ongoing aspect to everything that we're talking about here that we have to recognize and learn from and deal with, even though some of the dealing with has to do with the past and coping and learning how to sleep in spite of the fact that we lose sleep over our past reactions and situations.
Yeah, we have an interesting wrinkle in force encounters, and maybe we also saw it in sexual assault cases. But confabulation means honest lying. You're just making up what you think are inconsequential, and you're doing it subconsciously or non-consciously, right? But in police cases, if you guess on the distance and you're wrong, or you guess on the number of punches and you're wrong, you guess on the distance. Nicole's got a great case. Like, was it 1 arm's length or 2 arms length away? When you get those things wrong, now we're terminating officers. We're calling them liars. Whenever their experience doesn't match up to the objective truth of a video, we're calling them liars, and they're being indicted. They're being fired. They're being giglioed, which is a mandated reporting of credibility issues to the prosecution, such that they're no longer able to testify without disclosure to the defense of this purported credibility issue.
Right.
And in some places, if you're giglio, they just fire you. You just terminated, or they decertify you. I think we saw that in sexual assault cases, where if the victim's experience and memory of the experience, or the confabulated memory of the experience, was inconsistent with forensic evidence or with video, then she's just a liar, right? And I would look at those cases as you did, Dave, with more sophistication, and recognize a precise memory of an event that is consistent with every other witness and with video likely means there was some collaboration going on. Like, because the human mind does not record things like a video. It doesn't remember quotes like we would on a recording. We look at just the gist of the event, and we want to communicate meaning of the event, not precise details. That's not how we remember things and tell stories. But now, I don't know if it's better or worse. Maybe it doesn't need to be graded, but this idea that there's inconsistency now being leveled as evidence of lying continues to be a huge problem in these cases.
Well, and especially when it's a critical event, officer involved shooting, I think one thing we don't pay enough attention to is when you talk about the gist, your amygdala is about emotional memories. And when you think about traumatic stress and traumatic events or critical incidents, sexual assault, shootings, violent crime, those are emotional memories embedded, right? We're also asking during an interview process for somebody to take emotions and put them into words, to take that experience and translate it. And let's be honest, that's going to differ on a very individualistic level, because, what is a person's vocabulary? What is their emotional and feeling vocabulary? We're asking them to take, some people have like 3 things they bring to the table: happy, sad, pissed, right? That's kind of a narrow, it doesn't mean they don't feel much more complex issues, but they may not have the ability to verbalize some of that.
Articulation, yeah.
So there's articulation issues, and that's really under stress and overwhelming stuff. It's an emotional experience. It's emotional in the brain. It's the body. I mean, Vander Kolk's book, how the body remembers trauma, right? It's a whole thing. And, memories are like that too. But we don't talk enough about, Vaughn hit the video literacy. Video literacy it is not pushed out enough. There's not an understanding among officers, among investigators, hearing officers, judges, prosecutors. I mean, a basic understanding of video literacy and some good classes, I think, help people understand that the video and memory will not match. They will not match. If they do, somebody was watching the video writing the report, right? I mean, if it's tied together. But the foundation is it won't match. But the foundation of memory is faulty. I mean, that's right. The foundation of memory. Memory is faulty. And you start fleshing out enough research and questions that are being looked at. Older research, but even some newer stuff talks about memory retrieval to the point the entire memory is false.
Right.
And think about that with, and although I think we're getting better with both sexual assault and officer involved shootings, but think about how many times an individual is interviewed. Every time they have to recall, every time they have to retrieve, changes that. It's not the original memory. It's that quote, you know, you don't step in the same river twice. The river's not the same, neither is the man. I mean, and that's memory. They're not the same. And that's just memory itself, but that's married up to video. It's part of the questioning. Are we inadvertently leading people down a path because we think it's what's best? As an investigator, we want them to say what we want to get them to like what we think's a good outcome. So we're kind of dragging them along, trying to elicit these responses that actually like our intent is good. But the delivery method isn't what's real great because we're not capturing that narrative truth. You know, I mean, so there's just a lot of stuff. And with video, I mean, there's another quote. Donna Bridge has done some great research. I think it's a 2014, 2018 study. I apologize, I can't remember, but she even talks about video in that too, where your memory is built to be current. Your brain is built to live in the present.
Yeah.
Brain is not built to live in the past, and therefore something that happened that is crystal clear on video without all the stuff that, you know, we're not going to do a deep dive into, but the focus, attentional windows, you know, just because we can see something on a camera, what was the officer looking at, you know, important questions. But we live in the present, and that's where we're rooted. Depression and anxiety, when you start to think about it, depression comes if you go too much in the past. Anxiety comes when you're kind of worrying about the future, right? But for us, our brains tend to operate right here, right now, not about what happened. Some people, you know, you can ask them what they had for breakfast. It takes them a minute to figure it out. Mm-hmm. It happened a couple hours ago. You know, so when you tie that to betrayal, just from a lack of education standpoint, if you only know what you know, you're not going to morph your interviewing style to what's best for human performance and the limitations thereof. And that can be betrayal just on a foundation of you just don't know.
You don't know what you don't know.
And that's the easiest one to fix. That is the easiest one to fix. Like we have opportunity there. Hard to fix people who just choose not to, you know. All you can do is hope you give them a little nugget and they run with it and it kicks around a little bit and then maybe it makes a difference. But we can help people on their journey of wanting to learn if they're going to choose to work with us, you know.
We made that point too at the last one with the well said, Nicole. The perception of betrayal isn't always intentional, and so we're looking at this audience of people going, hey, look, we're not saying you guys are trying to hurt these officers. We're saying that there are ways you can inadvertently communicate betrayal to these officers, and to Nicole's point, that could be fixed, you know. So for those of you who think that you're doing the officer a favor by doing great evidence collection and isolating them from their friends and family and not letting them communicate, trying to anticipate every possible plaintiff's argument and every possible prosecution argument and shoring that up through your processes, where it makes it look like you're just dragging an officer through a process completely oblivious to its effects on that officer. We're saying that officer is going to come out the other side feeling judged, betrayed, not trusted. Quite frankly, you can destroy their avatar of themselves that we need them to have to competently and confidently negotiate the evil that we send them out to face, right? And then we bring them in and we break them down and we communicate, again, betrayal, we communicate lack of trust, we communicate second guessing, complete another lack of predictability in the relationships that they thought they had. And then we're going to turn around and send them back out to the street once we go, okay, you were fine. There's quite frankly just a better way. And we've got to continue in our mission to ensure people recognize that.
Can you talk about this whole area of betrayal and what you see and what you think you see, but we talked a little bit about hearing and listening, and how even what we think we hear when we're interviewing someone can be distorted by what we think about that person, even, or what our emotions are at the given moment. of what it is that we're talking about. You talked a little bit earlier, Nicole, about whether or not we're good listeners. And I know that from the research I've seen and read about, we only hear about 27 to 35% of what is actually being said to us. And the rest of it is just kind of jumbled up in our own thoughts. We lose focus just because we're humans, and that's the way our brains work. But doesn't that then have some implications into what you're talking about with regard to betrayal?
Oh, absolutely. Plus, you have to think of you hit the nail on the head for just the foundation of think about the brain, and especially in this day and age. Are we busy bee brains? Is there like phones and this and there's a lot of stimuli around, right? So we have that. Our brains just tend to wander. When I teach like mindfulness meditation, I don't turn everybody into these like transcendental meditation lists. I'm trying to get somebody, can you take 30 seconds of your life? Can we work on 30-second intervals of your brain not wandering? That's not easy for some people. 30 seconds, think about that.
Yeah.
Just sitting with a cup of coffee, sitting with a hot cup of coffee for 30 seconds and really like basically focusing on that coffee, the brain will bounce, right? And we have to learn how to pull it back. And that's a skill. But also people listen through their own lens of projection. And that's actually the bigger problem, right?
Yeah.
We project what we think onto someone else, and it has nothing to do with them. Part of when I work with, whether it's de-escalation, interviewing, whatever is, and Vaughn mentioned it once during this presentation already, it's not about you. If it's about you, you're in the wrong job. It is about the person you are with. And you owe that person that's an obligation that you've chosen in this role, whether it's on the street or during an interview. And whether it's check the ego, whether it's a learning thing, whatever the platform is, it can't be about you. It has to be about what you're doing. It has to be about justice, whatever that is, tied to your objective, right? Your police objective, whatever that looks like. But it can't be about your feelings, your thoughts, your perception, your, outcome bias, your hindsight bias. I mean, all the things that factor in, it needs to be about the other person. And if all you can do is bring to the table is, if that were my mom sitting there, my dad, my son, my best friend, if that were me in that chair, how would I want that officer to treat me?
Mm-hmm.
Like what would be that expectation? And, that's easily is a good place to start. How would I want to be treated from respect and believable, and somebody's engaged in my process and they're not even, I mean, take it for what it's worth, a little tangent, from a trauma perspective. Now, I'm not here to dictate policy by any means. I don't think officers should watch their video at all. I think it enhances trauma. We wouldn't have a rape victim watch their video. Why are we having officers watch their sex or their critical incident video? That's just me. I'm not trying to get away from something that's normalized and accepted in many cases. But if you don't think constant exposure to a certain kind of incident, if you don't have a skill set, creates negative impacts, there's that. Repeat interviews create negative impacts. If we don't package these things appropriately and attend to, all the subtle intricacies that come in, like Vaughn said, we deliver avoidance. I want to think, with our processes of internal investigations after a shooting, we have people, we isolate them from their friends. Avoidance is a great technique for about a minute in trauma processing, right? But sometimes we create it with the length of the administrative investigation, the criminal investigation. We've removed them. You can only talk to your spouse. You can only talk to your clergy and your lawyer. That's a much more narrow world than most people are used to. Yeah. Just something to think about. There's a lot of layers to this. So I might just wanted to touch on that because that all ties in to betrayal. It all just ties together. Vaughn, go ahead.
Interestingly, no, I mean, you're hitting it, and I want people to be as sophisticated as possible. I know that's not the point of this podcast. Nicole and I just got invited to teach 8-hour block down in Vegas to cover 8 hours of whatever we want on these issues, and I'm super excited about that because it's for the investigators to get them to be trauma informed and to get them to understand all these. But one of the things a lot of people don't realize, and they need to, Nicole, you reminded me when you said well, an officer is limited in their support system because we say you can only talk to your wife. right? But what I found in a case is as soon as you do talk to your wife, as soon as you text your wife, I'm okay, the opposing side is going to say, who did you contact after the shooting? And so here I'm sitting in my office evaluating a case, and I've got a file of this officer's cell phone that was dumped per subpoena, and it has every nude photo, every flirty photo with him and his wife, and every search he'd ever done. And here I am, half a country away, evaluating this. Talk about betrayal. Talk about failing to protect your officers from the reality of what this system is going to do to them, right? And it dictates how we do our communication on cases. It dictates how an officer should not have a cell phone anywhere near their patrol car when they're on duty. They shouldn't have access to their personal cell phone, because what we're seeing is the opposing counsel. This is such a small point, but it's apparently it just triggered me. Like, they're going to get it. They're going to get that phone. They're going to get your computer if they want. And so part of understanding the process and avoiding traumatizing these officers after they've been involved in critical incidents where they almost died, where they were shot at, and ultimately had to take someone else's life. And now we're going to data dump their entire life and expose it to strangers who do not have their best interests at heart.
Yeah.
Right. So again, back to our communicating betrayal. Dear Chief, did you know that was going to happen? Then why did your policy even allow them to have a personal cell phone? Why didn't your post-shooting procedures say you will not under any circumstances text your wife I'm okay, or call I'm okay, unless you do it from a government phone, and then hope she doesn't answer her phone because they're going to look at hers. There's two sides to that communication, so it needs to be landline to landline. Anyway, this is probably too specific for this audience, but it is the types of things that the more sophisticated you are about the process, you find ways that you need to be able to protect officers and those involved in the process.
No, I appreciate that, because this audience includes law enforcement and administrators and policymakers and in lots of different professions. I think it's all relevant.
Well, it's no different than when they try and introduce previous sexual history, right? In your sexual assault cases. Well, you were promiscuous, or you were an escort, or you were this. So therefore, basically, you can't be sexually assaulted. You can't be raped, or you are, and I'm just saying, like, all that past. And the thing is, that's not about the narrow window of what happened. It's no different. The window of the occurrence is the same: force encounter, sexual assault. If you were promiscuous for 10 years straight, up to the point you said no, you said no. End of story. And you should get judged in the window where you said no, not all the other stuff to muddy up the waters. So, and officers getting the same thing that sexual assault victims do too, where how many times has somebody said this, unfortunately, out loud, but in their head, they're just not a good victim. They don't have any jury appeal, right? We're gonna not take this to trial. Now that's a different level of betrayal in the sex assault world, but it happens.
For sure.
That lens sometimes gets put on the officer, how the video looks, right? Doesn't mean there's not the investigation that will flush things out, right? But just like Vaughn said, the video, oh, this is a problem. That's the same thing as saying, you're not a good victim. You don't even know. You literally don't even know. And so the rush to judgment definitely needs to be checked.
This is so funny. I don't know how to say this, artfully. I try. If you're a drunk driver and you get T-boned by a car, and the car was completely at fault. The other driver is completely at fault, but you're drunk. We want to focus on the fact that you were a drunk driver, and there's a way to look at that and go, well, you being drunk is irrelevant to the culpability of who caused this accident, right? Just because you're drunk and involved in an accident does not automatically make it your fault. All right. So I think that example, and then we hear so many cases where officers are involved in shootings, and the initial allegation is that the officer was racist. And I go, okay, that doesn't end the inquiry. Let's imagine for a second that the officer was racist. I still have to answer, was the threat assessment reasonable and was the response reasonable? And we want to, and in sexual assault cases, well, was she promiscuous? Was she promiscuous? Well, how did she dress? And I'm like, okay, let's ask and answer that question and then quickly go, it could be the most irrelevant part of this and likely is the most irrelevant part. You're trying to draw inferences from those data points that are not logical, they're not rational, and yet we are inclined to do it. And we, again, talk to executive leaders and those who are responsible for evaluating sexual assault cases. We've got to be able to say, we got to be able to bring them back to what are the relevant, most salient points in that investigation. I want to go back half a step to a point, and I know we're going to wrap up, Dave, I think.
You'll take as much time as you guys are willing to give.
Well, we said something, and similar to how earlier I said, the psychological influences that affect our cognitive processes don't just occur under stress. They are cognitive processes, right? The same thing about when we say we only hear 25% of a communication. We go, yes, that's, and if we're active listeners and we ask follow-up questions and we paraphrase and we sort of have a feedback loop built into our expert communications, we can get more accurate in assessing that communication. But typically we're not that motivated. We engage in sense making, right? We hear information, we believe we understood the information, and once we hit a threshold of, okay, I have enough, I'm not going to assign meaning to it, and I can start to make life decisions based on it, whether that life decision is merely a response, merely an emotional response, merely a communicated response. I don't need to memorize 100% of a conversation to get the meaning and then to craft a response or make a decision. What we know is that fast and frugal sense making, the heuristic sense making and decision making, can be less accurate. But as we go through life, engaging in everyday relationships, can you imagine what it would look like if we continued to probe for more and more information before we made a decision, before we responded? And some people do that, right? Some people are better and some people are worse at listening and taking control of accurate interpretation of messaging, right? And I laugh. Nicole and I recently had an experience with different people hearing different things during the same conversation, and so we're sophisticated communicators, and it happens to us, right? We both look back and go, in hindsight, I would have taken more control of ensuring the accuracy of messaging on both sides of that conversation. So to your point, if we're only catching 25%, I don't think that's necessarily a flaw. That is a feature oftentimes that allows us to operate in a really chaotic world.
That's true. And it's an aspect I think that we need to be more aware of. That's the whole purpose of this podcast and having you on specifically, Nicole and Vaughn, is bringing to light some of the things that my past interviews, I've only had a few episodes now, but the series I'm running right now of 4 people who were sexually assaulted on the college campuses that they attended, and making sense of some of the things that they've said and you have covered in really good articulable ways, and ways that make the listener put some things together to make sense of. And that's, I think, critical. And I think it's critical what you're doing with your Force Science organization and the training that you're doing. It's admirable. I mean, it's difficult, but it's admirable and appreciated on so many levels.
Well, Dave, thank you. And I think you hit a big nail on the head. And I want to tell you why. When I worked inpatient IV substance use for dual diagnosis, so it's longer term inpatient care to help people move forward. One of the hiccups that was a barrier to treatment, especially actually with alcohol more so than other drugs, was the lack of understanding of the impact on the brain. And how long was my memory going to be bad? And how long was I going to feel like this? How long before the neurotransmitters level out? Because people were relapsing thinking they would never get better. And then when you provide a foundation of education of, hey, your brain is injured, just like your body is injured, it takes time to recover. The recovery process can take up to, and you start filling in blanks and you start talking about that. For some people, that psychoeducation piece was the window to the world of recovery, because they were relapsing thinking, never am I going to feel differently, never am I going to get better. And alcohol is one that, if you are a chronic alcoholic, you're looking at a good 2 years on the brain before things have a tendency to settle into a norm, right? And so relapse would happen 6 months, a year and a half in. When somebody finally sits you down and says, hey, your brain, you may feel some negative impacts for about 2 years. It might seem like a long time, but if you hold on and keep your eye on that prize, just understand that happens. And I think you're hitting the sexual assault component from that psychoeducation piece. And I think for some people, that's all the difference in the world and part of that healing, to be honest. It's knowing the responses, it's knowing all these abnormal things that you're feeling aren't as abnormal as you think. What happened to you is abnormal. All the things you're feeling are the normalized responses that accompany it. And being part of normalizing that experience of feelings, that a person is not alone, that how their brain's impacted, how their body feels, dissociation, derealization, these coping skills that we know in sexual assault, it's not just fight, flight, freeze. You can be completely paralyzed, right? Tonic immobility, where we used to, why didn't you fight back? Because somebody physically couldn't move. They're dissociated. They are checked out, right? Knowing those things and normalizing that for the person. Hey, if you experience this, and that's a therapy thing too. If you experience that during your sexual assault, there's a likelihood that dissociation will become one of your coping skills. Let's talk about that, right? Because it just things tied together. And I just want to thank you for bringing that to a platform, because I think it's good to have the conversations, but that education piece is huge, because sometimes people don't know why their body and brain are doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
Just get a little information. It can really be a turning point in their recovery. And so I just want to commend you for that. I think that's huge.
I appreciate those comments, because I think the listeners need to hear that, whether they're victims or survivors or not. I think law enforcement, the criminal justice professionals, prosecutors, defense attorneys, everybody needs to hear what you just said and make those connections real in their own thinking. As we said, kind of at the outset of this, there's so many layers to all of this that are so impactful in people's lives. It kind of makes me have to say this. I need you guys to come back on this podcast, whether we do it again together or individually. I'm hoping that in the future you'll agree to join me again, because this has been such an amazing hour and 25 minutes. I've loved it.
It's been awesome. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm always happy to collaborate with Vaughn. We definitely are on a mission to help educate and basically help people expand that worldview. And I'm happy that we get to be part of that with you, and just be able to carry on this information. And, if we touch one investigator, one person, one survivor, one victim, whatever it is, to just let them know, hey, you know what, you're not alone. You can recover. There is hope. You can grow. You don't have to be the victim of your circumstance. You can choose to move beyond it, regardless whether it's sexual assault, violent crime, forced encounter. You have control of that in your destiny, as an individual, with support and all that. And I just think that's the really important message: hope and recovery and growth, and for everyone, for everyone involved, whichever facet they're listening from. Just know that you have it in you to do it, even if the road's rocky, because it's better. The journey to climb out of hell is difficult, but staying in hell is a lot worse.
Yeah.
So, anything, you have my contact information, people want to reach out, whatever that looks like. I mean, anytime I can be a resource, I'm happy to do that.
Excellent. I appreciate that. I'd like to make your contact information for both of you available to our listeners in our notes that accompany this episode, and also for Force Science. If people are interested in getting a hold of your organization for training purposes or just for general information, I'd like to make that available.
Yeah.
If that's okay. And I know you guys know this.
Yeah, absolutely.
But you also need to hear it from me. You make an excellent team. It's amazing how good it is to have you both here together and to listen to you talk back and forth on the topics that either I or either one of you bring up to each other. It's just a really good interaction, a good relationship, and I can't tell you how much it's appreciated. I think our listeners will recognize that and agree with me too. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Oh, she's been great. Hey, if I could just add something you guys said, we don't often go into our discussions with folks thinking about the trauma the individuals in the room have already experienced. But Dave, you remember there wasn't a single 2-week course where somebody wasn't doing an initial disclosure, right? That somebody came out of that course saying, I trust you guys, you get it, and I want to share. We get that in every Force Encounters, certification course, every 2-day foundations course. Someone will come up, and one guy, I remember, out of Pennsylvania said, I shot a guy. My memory of that experience, a kid, he ended up shooting a kid. My experience of that, I could not understand an aspect of it. I thought I was crazy. And when we explained the human performance issues and the psychological influences that occurred during stress, it finally made sense. And it was 15 years of guilt and 15 years of crazy making behavior before someone finally stood up in front of him and said, you're normal. And we would have been surprised if you had any other reaction to that event. And it's the same thing we see with sexual assault victims. You're normal, and the reactions you had to it are normal reactions to abnormal events. And we can never lose sight of that. We can't get so administrative, procedural, and policy driven and procedures driven that we forget that there are people in every one of these audience groups who this is the first time they're hearing this, and something's going to click, and it could absolutely put them back on the road of normalcy, right? A road of recovery. And so I thank you, Dave, for getting this out. Thank you for inviting us and including us in getting this message out and bridging what you're doing in the sexual assault world, something that is really important to Nicole and I, with what we're now doing in the Force Encounters world, right? And we're finding ways to marry those lessons learned up, and you've given us a great bridge to do that. So thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much for those words. I really appreciate all of that. You guys are great. Thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for the invite.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Talk to you both.
Thank you, guys.
All right, we'll see you.
Bye.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories. I want to express my gratitude to Nicole and Vaughn for taking time out of their busy schedules to be with me for this interview. Their insight and perspectives are definitely an undeniable contribution to the ongoing strides that we are making with this podcast and in the criminal justice and advocacy disciplines in understanding trauma and what it means to be trauma-informed. All of this is helping bring justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Please join me next week as I have another incredibly powerful interview with my special guest, R.C. Gray. R.C. has an enthralling story of kidnap, rape, attempted murder, and self-rescue that is not only gripping from the trauma and true crime perspective, but also is robust and inspiring in the intense work of ongoing survival, healing, and thriving. Make sure to listen in next week for R.C.'s mind-blowing and gripping interview. Please share this episode with everyone you know, rate the show, subscribe, and leave me a note in the comments section about how this show is impacting your life, whether you're a victim, survivor, or not. In the meantime, don't forget to do your part in bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault by supporting those around you in their efforts to heal and thrive in our families, workplaces, and communities. And the best way to do that is to start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.